Now I'd like to invite Georgie, Dr. Georgie Wemish. He's going to chair the session tonight.
Hello, good evening. I just wanted to say a little bit about how I got involved in the Brick Lane Circle, and it was through work that I've been doing since the early 1990s with students at Tower Hamlets College. Following the election, as Josh was just talking about, of a BNP councillor and the attack on Kudus Ali, who was a 17-year-old student at our college. And something that really struck me at the time was how the college was based on a road called the East India Dock Road. Other parts of the college were very close to the area that had been the docks, is now where Canary Wharf is. The slogan for the BNP at the time was "Rights for Whites, Island Homes for Island People," and one of the things that they were talking about the whole time was that whereas white people had been living on the Isle of Dogs for 125 years or for however many generations, they would try and exclude any people who had been descended from the subjects of the empire from having any sort of full belonging to the East End. And the courses that I started at Tower Hamlets College were to try and find some of these histories and unearth in much more detail about the 400-year relationship between Britain and Bengal, and to work from there. And hence I became involved in the Brick Lane Circle and the Plassey's Legacy work that Mohammed's been involved in. Which brings me to the Bengal Famine and to Madhusree's book, which I think is incredibly important. I only finished reading it last night. The amazing detail in it means that it really requires a lot of concentration. It's a very powerful book for that reason. It is important in terms of the East End, I believe, because one of the discourses, one of the ways that people in the East End have sometimes spoken about their right to belong here has been through referring to the Second World War, through referring to the experience of living through the Blitz and through rationing, etc., and using those experiences to therefore exclude many other people from the mixed community from fully belonging to this area. And one of the things that Madhusree's book is it shows very powerfully how linked, how dependent what was happening in the East End at that time was to the really appalling things that were happening in Bengal during that period. So it's important for that reason, and it's even more important from my perspective because it not only mobilizes these silenced histories, but actually it goes through and analyzes the processes whereby those histories have been silenced. And I think that that is extremely important for people to understand. So on behalf of Brick Lane Circle, I'd very much like to welcome Madhusree Mukerjee to give her talk about the Bengal Famine. Thank you.
I'm very happy to be here tonight, and I am grateful to the Brick Lane Circle for having invited me. And thanks, Georgie, for suggesting that I come. I was asked to give an academic talk, and that's what I'll do. So if there's any bit of background that you feel that you don't get, just stop me and ask. All right, so the setting, my talk is mainly about the Bengal Famine, which is a calamity that occurred during World War II in 1943 in Bengal, and also to a lesser extent in some surrounding states, in Orissa, in Madras, and so on, but worst of all in Bengal, in which at least 3 million people died. And as I will, and the content, there is a political context to all of this, which I will not be discussing. And the political context is that in 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, India also declared war on Germany. This was a decision made by the Viceroy of India, Lord Linlithgow. And he did so without consulting with any of the Indian politicians who were really angry because committing to a world war is, a big deal. And he did it on behalf of 400 million subjects. without asking their opinion. But it was always foregone, it was always known that this would happen because during World War I, Britain had depended very heavily on Indian resources. So what happened was that the Congress Party, which was the dominant political party at the time, objected, and they tried to put up some resistance, and their attempts were thwarted. And ultimately, in 1942, there was an uprising called the Quit India movement. So at the time the Bengal famine breaks out, all of India's political leaders, except for Jinnah and the Muslim League, are in prison. And Gandhi is in prison, Nehru is in prison. So there is really no kind of political representation speaking up on behalf of Indians. It is, in the words of a British general, an occupied and hostile country. So what I'm going to talk about is one of the key point messages in my book. This is my book, Churchill's Secret War, which is that the Bengal famine occurred not just because of local factors. There were some local factors which I will discuss, but particularly because India happened to be a colony, and what you do with the colony is you use it, especially in wartime. You take resources from it and you use it to fight the war. So what I will discuss in detail is the causes, I will list the causes of the war, of the famine, and I will go on to explain how the British war cabinet, especially Churchill, made things much worse. Now, the famine started around February 1943, and in October 1943, Lord Wavell became the new Viceroy of India. And when he arrived in India, he found that even the loyalist politicians, the ones who were pro-British, who were in the Viceroy's Council, for instance, were very upset about this Bengal famine, which was happening at that time. And they wanted an inquiry. And this inquiry was very inconvenient because Wavell, he had been Commander-in-Chief of India at a time when there was a scorched earth policy in Bengal, and he knew that it would end up indicting the British. So he and Amory was the Secretary of State for India. He's based in London. The two of them came up with a famine inquiry commission that they could live with. And they selected the members very carefully. These were senior civil servants, mainly British, some Indian, who were known for their loyalty. Although, as you will see, the choice was perhaps not perfect. The commission was not permitted to interview anyone who had since left India or any military officers. One important person to interview would have been Lord Linlithgow. Linlithgow was the viceroy at the time the famine started. He was an expert in agriculture. He understood very well what was happening. He was not interviewed, nor was Wavell, who actually was in India at the time. And the commission was advised to avoid, I'll read, strategical and other circumstances as may have contributed to internal transportation difficulties or affected HMD's, His Majesty's government's decisions in regard to shipping of imports. Now when you translate this, what it means is that they're not allowed to look at railways. The trains at the time were all being used for the war effort, so you had troops and goods being landed in Bombay, for instance, and they were being transported across India to Bengal. The far end of Bengal was being built up as a war theater because the Japanese were in Burma and so on. So the trains were all being used to transport war goods, and they couldn't be used to transport grain from Punjab to Bengal. So there was wheat in Punjab, some of it anyway, and wasn't transported to Bengal. But the more important part from my point of view is the shipping. In particular, the Commission was told that it could not look into questions of shipping, that is, whether food could have been shipped from outside India to India to relieve the famine. So you see that the Famine Inquiry Commission accordingly held a lot of hearings in secret, and in 1945, I believe the publication coincided with the end of the war, so no one actually read it. But at the time, it blamed the famine on the Japanese occupation of Burma. That was because the Japanese had occupied Burma in March of 1942, And at that point, India used to import about between 1 and 2 million tons of rice every year from Burma and Thailand. And this import was not coming. Scorched earth measures by local officials. The Famine Commission noted that police and the military had gone around destroying boats and rice boats because these were the main form of transport in Bengal, which has a lot of rivers. And they were afraid that the Japanese would use the boats to invade India. That is, they would land in coastal Bengal and then they would use the boats to move up towards Calcutta. And therefore, they destroyed at least 2/3 of all the boats in Bengal and destroyed its economy at the same time. Crop failure in Bengal in 1942 in October, there was a massive cyclone and a lot of a flood. There were pests and so on. Failure by the government of India to send wheat to Bengal, as I already mentioned, there was some wheat in Punjab and that wasn't sent. Corruption and inefficiency of the Bengal administration, which was completely confused. It had a famine on its hands. It did not have the resources to deal with it. And large-scale hoarding by local traders. In particular, the Famine Commission did not discuss the broader context of the famine, the inflationary financing of the war effort, for instance. And I will go into each of these things in a lot of detail. It did not note that the scorched earth orders were not just some local officials panicking, but that these orders had actually come from out of London, from the War Cabinet itself. When it became, and I will again go into these, because it was just not possible at that point in time to defend India from Japanese attack. The Famine Commission did not tell anybody that the grain was being exported in large quantities in 1942 and also to some extent in 1943. It did not discuss the possibility of grain imports into India. It did not deal at all with the possibility that there could have been relief sent from outside. It just assumed that there wasn't enough shipping. It left the impression that Bengalis would not eat wheat. And this is important because the only grain really available in large quantities was Australian wheat. So if the famine had to be relieved, it would have had to be wheat. And the commission created the impression that Bengalis would rather die than eat wheat. In essence, the Famine Commission did exactly what it was told to do by Amory and Weber. It explained the famine entirely in terms of local parameters. And it ignored every lead that led back to London. And unfortunately, the Famine Commission report has been taken as definitive by such prominent people, as I said, who used it to argue, number one, that the food shortage was not in itself enough to cause the famine. And that has been challenged by a number of people. Number two, he said that the government of India did not understand the factors driving famine and could not have predicted it. I think that second point is he's clearly wrong, because if you look at the mass of documents, that I have looked at, you see that the government of India knew that there was going to be a famine. It just didn't do anything about it because its priority was the war effort. And we'll get to that. In 1942, in fact, there were official warnings of famine. To place the Bengal famine in the full global context, you need all of these other documents. The transfer of power volumes are familiar to any historian of the period. What they are is a set of massive collections of documents. They're published by His Majesty's government. And they look at correspondence between the Viceroy and the Secretary of State for India, correspondence within India, and so on. It's an official selection. And it's very important, because if you read it carefully, there's a lot that you can understand. Now, the Nanavati papers are really interesting. One of the members of the Famine Commission actually kept his copies of the secret transcripts of the commission instead of destroying them. He had been ordered to destroy them. He did not destroy them. They can be found in the National Archives in India. And when you look at the transcripts, you realize the panic, the confusion, and it's not just that you understand how much that the Famine Commission described as sort of known and certain, whereas in the background there was a lot of uncertainty. To give a small example, Pinnell, who is one of the civil servants in charge of the scorched earth policy, he said, I don't know how many boats we took out. We took out 9/10 of all the boats that we could find, and I have no idea how many are left. Now, that kind of statement, the Famine Commission translates into actual figures of the number of boats taken out. And it comes out as 2/3. So you see, there's a lot of, it's very interesting. The Nanavati papers are a fascinating set of documents. You also understand that all of India's ocean-worthy ships, there were about 80,000 tons worth of ships, of shipping that was in the control of the British government and was not released to carry famine relief. The Ministry of War Transport papers, at one point I realized I wanted to understand what the ships were actually doing at the time. So I looked at the Ministry of War Transport papers, and it turns out they have an amazing number of papers on the famine itself. Just talking about the amount of crop production, of course the number of ships, the different decisions made by the War Cabinet on shipping and so on. And actually, the core of my indictment of Winston Churchill lies in the Ministry of War Transport papers, because you can see that the ships were there, the grain was there, it just was not used to relieve the Bengal famine. The War Office papers are interesting because that's where you find the scorched earth information and other stuff. Cherwell papers. Now, this is a kind of an oddball. Lord Cherwell was a close friend and advisor of Winston Churchill. And I was interested in Lord Cherwell because he was a physicist and I used to be a physicist myself. And when you study physics over many, many years, you get to know who the main characters are. And I had never heard of Lord Cherwell. I'd never heard of it. So I started reading up every biography I could find. And in one of these biographies, I found a defense of his actions during the Bengal Famine. And that showed me he had played a really important part. So I went and looked at the Cherwell papers, which are in Oxford in Nuffield College. And you find that every time the Bengal Famine came up for discussion in the War Cabinet, and there were at least 3 times in 1943, that the sending relief was discussed, demanded by the India Office and turned down by the War Cabinet. Every time, Lord Cherwell sent a memo to Winston Churchill saying, I don't think it's worth using our ships in this way, essentially. Amory Diaries. Amory was the Secretary of State for India at the time. And at the time of the famine, he took a large part of the blame for the famine. But if you actually look at the role he was playing with respect to the War Cabinet, he was always asking for relief and being turned down. And his diaries are very revealing of the tone of the discussions of the War Cabinet. Because you can see that Churchill was absolutely furious with India at this point. And that comes out through Amory's diaries, because one reason he could see India would have to eventually be set free after the war, and he couldn't stand that. And the other reason was something called the sterling debt, which I'll get into. India was owed money by the British at this point. Now, traditionally, for like the last 200 years, India had been in debt to Britain. For instance, after the Sepoy Mutiny, or the First War of Independence, which was put down by importing British troops, that cost £50,000, I believe. That was added to India's debt. So India had to pay essentially for being defeated in the First War of Independence. And not only that, it also had to pay interest on these debts, railways and so on. So for about 200 years, India had owed money to Britain and had been paying interest on this money that it owed. Suddenly, because of India's contribution to the war effort, the tables are turned, and Churchill is ballistic. He can't stand it. He has these tirades in the War Cabinet in which he's screaming about how it's terrible to defend India during the war and then have to pay for it. Churchill papers, Churchill papers I found there in Cambridge. I didn't find them particularly useful. They're very disorganized, I thought, and probably censored. Now, the official histories of British wartime food supply, these were extremely important for establishing the background against which the War Cabinet made its decisions. All right. So to summarize, if you put this all together, and I will go through these in detail, the factors driving famine were inflationary financing of the war effort, and this is really important, probably the main factor. Acquisition of wheat and rice in India for a war effort in India and abroad. India was about 500,000 Indian soldiers were fighting in the Middle East and in North Africa India was responsible for feeding them. India was also had about 2 million soldiers in the country itself who were very poorly equipped, but they all had to be fed. And I'll talk a little more about that. The loss of imports from Japan was definitely important. So were the scorched earth policies in Bengal, the cyclone and the short crop. So you see there's a huge mess of causes of the Bengal famine. Removal of shipping from the Indian Ocean at a key point in January 1943, and I'll discuss that. The stockpiling of wheat for post-war use in the United Kingdom, and this is Britain serving as the world's largest hoarder at this point. Churchill's hostility towards Indians. And actually, I don't go into that a whole lot because it's very hard to kind of pin down how much of his decisions were strategic and how much was emotional. You can't get into someone's mind that easily. Inflationary financing. Almost all of India's industrial production had been geared to the war effort. Cloth. So India produced during the war some 600,000 miles of cotton cloth. So just to give you a sense of how much this is, if you have a bale of cloth and you start rolling it around the equator, it would cover the earth 24 times. You would circle the earth. So that's how much cotton cloth India produced, and it was all going towards the army. 415 million pieces of military uniform, for instance. And one of the things that you see during and after the famine is this severe shortage of cotton for people to wear. You have the famine victims are all naked or half naked, and women can't leave the house because they have nothing to wear. They're literally naked. They're hiding inside their huts because they can't leave the house in the daytime. They have to go out at night to wash or eat or cook. Now, India provided goods and services worth £2 billion to the war effort. Now, there was a pre-war agreement between India and the United Kingdom by which India was going to pay for all the war effort that was within India, plus one division in the Middle East, and the UK was going to pay for everything outside India's borders. And that, at the end of the war, it broke down to roughly 1 billion each. Now, the 1 billion that the UK ended up owing India was not being paid during the war. These goods were being extracted by paying for them, and the Indian government did not have enough money, so it just printed money. The money supply went up by about 7 times during the war. Now, during World War I, the money supply had gone up by 2 or 3 times. And things had been extremely difficult in India. I think there would have been a famine, except that there was a flu epidemic which killed 12 million people. And the fatalities from this flu was worst in all the districts that were really very hungry. So it's quite possible that the flu took away the people who might otherwise have been killed by famine during World War I. But you see, in World War II, it's even worse. The money supply is being increased by 6 million, by 6 times, and all this money is going to the industries. It's going to the factories, it's going to industrialists and to factory workers. And it's having the effect of sucking out all the food from the rural areas and taking it into urban centers. So that's why the famine in Bengal occurred in rural areas. There wasn't a famine in Calcutta as such, or even because the city people were taken care of. They were working in factories, they were working in banks, or even the coal mines. The famine was purely rural phenomenon. The sterling debt had, as I've mentioned, increased Churchill's hostility to India so that he couldn't really even talk about India without becoming really angry. They printed, the cash led to hyperinflation. And the other thing is that the inflation led to hoarding. Now, how does this work? If you are a businessman and you realize that the price of grain is going to go up, you buy it up because you know you can sell it later and make a profit. So that's hoarding and speculation. But it's a normal part of the way a market works if it anticipates scarcity. In fact, it's happening now. When prices go up, merchants buy, they hoard, and they make things worse because they're taking things off the market. They're taking things off the market and they're increasing prices still further because people who don't have any money can't get any food anymore. So, and the other thing that was happening was that although there was wheat in the Punjab, the families of the soldiers, they weren't selling because they didn't trust the cash. And there's a long story to why they didn't trust the cash. After World War I, the exchange rate between the rupee and the sterling had been devalued. So they were afraid that if they get the cash now, after the war, it won't be worth very much. And that also resulted in people investing in commodities rather than cash. And the only commodity around was grain. In August 1942, the War Cabinet was told by a member of the Viceroy's inner circle that we can have famines and riots arising from inflation alone. 4 exports of rice. In March 1942, the Japanese occupy Burma, and India can't get its standard import of rice anymore. So it's facing a crisis. But at this juncture, the War Cabinet insists that India absorb this loss and also serve as a supplier of rice to other parts of the empire that need rice, such as Ceylon. Ceylon was an important naval base, for instance. So Churchill in particular insisted that Bengal and India as a whole export rice. In the fiscal year 1942 to 1943, now I have to tell you, fiscal year begins in March. Okay, so in March 1942, Japanese reached the Indian border, and then you have this export starting. And you have to contrast this to the way the UK population was treated during the war. In World War I, there were certain difficulties with feeding UK because UK is very heavily dependent on imports. And the ships weren't arriving on time, people panicked and they started hoarding, and there were temporary shortages. So for the entire period between the two world wars, civil servants in the United Kingdom was trying to figure out how to feed the United Kingdom during a war. And in 1936, they started actually planning for the war. It seems really far ahead. But it was decided that the UK needed to have a stockpile of at least 3 months of every important commodity. So by the time the war broke out, you had the entire system of rationing and price control having been worked out, coupons had been printed and distributed, huge stockpiles had been built up, and so on. In contrast, India has an enemy at its border, and it has no stockpiles. It's being forced to export at this point. And quite significant amounts. Now, it also turned out that although India had about 5 divisions, I believe, that were very well equipped and trained, they were all abroad. And there was some policy to this. Churchill felt that if they were in India and there was an uprising in India, like the 1857 mutiny, would be very difficult. So he made sure that the best equipped troops were all abroad where they would be very useful fighting the Axis. In India, you had 2 million soldiers, as I mentioned, but they were very poorly equipped. In fact, the only equipment they had was good enough for fighting unarmed Indians. It wasn't good enough for fighting the Japanese, who were really extremely efficient fighters. And also, India just did not have any equipment. It had not a single modern bomber. It had not a single modern tank or armored car. It required something like 520 anti-aircraft guns. It had only 30 of them. India was producing for the war, but all of it had been taken west. So India, when the Japanese no one had actually anticipated that the Japanese would reach India's border. And in fact, that was why a lot of the major factories had been placed in Calcutta. So at this point, the War Cabinet decides the only way to defend India is by a scorched earth policy, like Stalin had used with his own people. Just destroy the economy, so that the Japanese, if they come into India, they will not be able to survive. So in Bengal, around January and February 1942, the police and the soldiers went around destroying rice. And I have a friend here, Nazis, who did a radio program for the BBC in which he interviewed local people from East Bengal. And one of the people he said he saw piles of rice being set on fire by soldiers. And another journalist I talked to told me that in Borishal, I believe, district, tens of thousands of tons of rice that was stored in these riverside ports were dumped into the water. There was total chaos and panic because all of the officers were removed. Even a lot of people were evacuating from East Bengal. All white women and children were removed and so on. Now, after things had quieted down for a bit, in April 1942, the Bengal government sent up agents, decided we shouldn't destroy all this rice, let's buy it up instead. It sent out agents to buy up the rice for the war effort. And all of this, I have to say, had the effect of making any extant stores of rice go underground, because if you are a landowner, you have rice, and you know it's going to be seized or destroyed, you hide it, and that's what a lot of people did. 1942, even though there had been a bumper crop, there were food riots and hunger marches in 1942, and in August 1942, Bengal's Chief Minister, Fazlul Haq, he warns of famine resulting from scorched earth policies. I have to say this in case you want to read up about this. It wasn't called a scorched earth policy, it was called a denial policy, a boat denial and a rice denial policy. But the original orders from the War Cabinet very specifically used the words scorched earth. In October 1942, there was a massive cyclone. There was a 20-foot wall of water that entered in western Bengal, districts of Midnapur, Kontai, and these areas. Killed about 30,000 people. And this no relief sent for weeks, that refers to the district of Midnapur, in which, I told you the Quit India movement had begun in 1942. In August 1942, that was just about a couple of months before this happened. And it had been very active in Mednipur district itself, where there was thousands of people converged upon government offices and tried to take it over. A lot of them were killed, and so on. So the government in Bengal was very hostile. The Governor Herbert was, at this point, John Herbert, he was very hostile to people in Mednipur. And he saw the cyclone as a chance to, get the upper hand. So he did not allow the newspapers in Calcutta to publish news of the cyclone. Did not send any relief. In fact, a lot of relief workers who were sent by private charities were arrested as agitators. The other thing was that as part of the repression of the Quit India movement, the government was sending around sepoys, troops, to burn down the homes and the rice supplies of Congress sympathizers, and this continued even after the cyclone. So that you have ministers from Calcutta going to Mednipur to review cyclone damage, and they see smoke rising in the distance from the fires that are being set by the police. Now this wet weather spread crop disease, this is controversial because Amartya Sen says that what Amartya Sen did was he takes the figures from the Famine Commission's report, which say that there wasn't a huge amount of shortage. But there are other writers who have pointed out that agriculture was really harmed at this point, and there probably was a shortage. And estimates of the shortage vary widely. Now the official, now there's a lot of, like I said, I don't want to say that the shortage was this and it wasn't that, because there is no agreement on this at all. I believe that there was a substantial shortage, but it's hard to prove. In November, December 1942, actually, Viceroy Linlithgow asked the War Cabinet for import of 600,000 tons of wheat. And this was by April, because he needed to keep up the war effort. The government at this point didn't even have enough food to feed the army. And he wanted to feed the army and the war workers, that is all the people in the different factories. And incidentally, this import of food, if it did come, would deter hoarding, because it would take the army off the market and prices would drop. But this, in January 1943, Churchill and his friend Churchill made a really key decision. They cut the shipping in the Indian Ocean. Now what had happened was that British shipping was being impacted very heavily by German U-boats in the Atlantic. So the Germans were attacking the convoys of food that were coming across the Atlantic from the US. And at this point, Churchill felt that the stockpile in the United Kingdom had fallen too low and that it needed to be built up again. And the only way he could think of doing that was to take all the ships away from the Indian Ocean, bring it over to the Atlantic, so that you could have food being shipped from North and South America to the United Kingdom. And Churchill cut the shipping in the Indian Ocean by about 60%, leaving only 40 ships. And these 40 ships also, the bulk of their job was to supply the war effort in North Africa. So then you have only 2 or 3 ships left in the entire Indian Ocean plying between Australia and India. In fact, only enough ships that India could still supply to the United Kingdom what the United Kingdom needed, mainly tea, cotton, these kind of things. Now, as it happens, the United Kingdom stockpile in December 1942 of food and raw materials was 15.8 million tons. And over the next 6 months, it proved to be 4.5 million tons more than was consumed, so that if not a single shipload of supplies had arrived in the United Kingdom for that period, it wouldn't have started. So you see, this entire crisis was manufactured by Lord Churchill. And he had a reason, which I will get to later. He wanted to build up the stockpile for future use. Now in Bengal, what happened? The officials find that they have enough food to feed the army for only 2 weeks. You can't let an army starve, they're going to kill you. So, up till that point, they have been trying to somehow control the economy, maintain some price controls, but now they give it all up. They tell their agents, and this is a quote from the Nanavati papers, to go to any place and purchase at any price. Just buy up every bit of rice that you can find and store it for us. We don't have enough storehouses. The agents bought up the rice and stored it. A lot of them stored it on their own account for hoarding and speculation. There is no accounting for how much was actually bought up. But what you see is that right away, even in rural Bengal, even though transport was so difficult, all of the rice gets sucked out of the villages and into storehouses where they wait for transport to Calcutta, which is and to the army. And in the meantime, it's not just the Bengal administration, it's the army, it's the railways, it's the Bengal Chamber of Commerce. They're all competing with one another to buy up everything that they can get. Famine starts. Now, Barents is the official history of British wartime shipping, and there is this amazing sentence, there's a typo here, I'm sorry. In the Indian Ocean area, the burden of paying for victory shifted from place to place to ease the weight, came to rest. Finally came to rest. So it was actually the shipping that tilted the balance. The shipping went from maintaining the trade and balance in the Indian Ocean area to the Atlantic in order to feed the United Kingdom. In essence, the famine started because Indian civilians had lower entitlements. Entitlements is a language introduced by one Pasel, and I certainly completely accept this language. What he says is that the famine really started because some people were simply not entitled to food in that they couldn't purchase it. And at least in the political system, they had no right to it. So here we're still talking about the first half of 1943. In lieu of its request for 600,000 tons of wheat, India received 30,000 tons because the shipping just wasn't there. And Churchill says, I'm glad to learn from the Minister of War Transport that a strict line is being taken in dealing with requests for cereals from the Indian Ocean area. They must learn to look after themselves as we have done. So now I'm going to just stop. In my book, I have a description of the famine as it was felt on the ground, and I have to say that was my original motivation for writing this book. I wanted to understand what it feels like, and I had no idea that I would end up finding all this stuff. So instead of reading from my book, I'm going to just show you some pictures. These are drawings by Zainul Abidin, who is a famous Bangladeshi artist, and I find them really compelling. And what you have to remember when you see these drawings is that these scenes are being repeated millions of times over. At that point, even in a city like Calcutta, you couldn't walk around without tripping over dead bodies. So what the people in the villages started doing was they started to migrate to the city, which was where all the food had gone. And they ended up dying on the pavements because even in the city there wasn't any relief. I'm going to skip this one because I made a mistake in adding it. This one I find actually really extremely powerful. I feel like if I were dying of famine, I would like to hide. And that was part of the sad sorrow of it. You can't have any dignity when, it's really impossible for us to imagine the condition of not having any food. I mean, I haven't been able to fast for even a single day. I know people have, but it's torment. It's a form of torture. In August 1943, in July, Lithgow asked one more time for grain. He said, famine has broken out. I'm not asking for grain for the people. In fact, he never did. Possibly because he knew that the only argument that had a chance with the war cabinet was war-related. He asked for 500,000 tons of wheat in order to keep up the war effort. Again, it would feed the army, it would feed the war workers, it would have sort of extra effect of deterring hoarding because by taking the army off the market, prices would fall and so on. But at this point, Churchill wants to conserve the wheat for British and European use after the war. And this seems like really early to be planning ahead, but that is indeed what he was doing. Churchill wanted at that point to invade the Balkans. He had a plan for invading Greece and Yugoslavia, which actually failed. But in preparation for that invasion, he was building up a stockpile of wheat to feed Balkan civilians after they had been liberated. So, on August 4th, when the War Cabinet discusses the Bengal famine, it does not schedule any relief at all for Bengal, and this is really remarkable. It says we can send 50,000 tons of wheat to Ceylon to wait there for further instructions. We can send 100,000 tons of barley from the Middle East. But as it turns out, the War Cabinet also conveyed to the Ministry of War Transport that these were not urgent. And so the War Cabinet, after that, Churchill went off to the US, and the shipping ministry did not schedule anything for India at all. Because there is a quote, which I haven't put in here, the War Cabinet minutes are very clear that India is not a priority. Instead, what you have is some 70,000 tons of wheat, Australian wheat, going every month from Australia to Ceylon in the Middle East, and another 170,000 tons going at the same time to the stockpile that he's building in the Balkans, which actually is never used. It's only used after the war because this Balkan invasion plan failed. As a lot of people had said it would fail, it was poorly planned. So then you have, through the rest of the year 1943, famine is continuing. People are dying, thousands of them every day. At meetings on September 24th and November 10th, Amory managed to bring it up two more times. The War Cabinet ordered 80,000 tons of wheat. Remember, the original demand had been 500,000 tons, 130,000 tons of barley. I don't really know what became of the barley because somehow it was really very unwelcome in Bengal. I don't quite understand. Bengalis simply did not seem to like or eat or take to barley. They had indigestion. Especially after you've been suffering from famine for about a month or so, your entire system breaks down, and any solid food can be fatal to you at that point. So to save a famine victim is very difficult. It has to be extremely carefully medically supervised and so on. Now, the British, even in the US, there were some questions raised. There was an Indian immigrant to the US who managed to bring it up with some US congressmen. Why is the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, I believe, I'm not quite sure what UNRRA stands for anymore, it's slipped my mind. But this was the agency that was set up to feed Europe after the war. And there was an application made, please feed India. But the British government actually did not allow this application to go through. in December, at the same time, all of these ships in the Atlantic continue to build up the UK stockpile so that it reaches 18.5 million tons. So why at this point in the war, when the war is actually being won, is the stockpile still increasing? And the answer is that the UK anticipated a real collapse in its economy after the war because it was heavily indebted to the US and to India. And it knew it would have to import food. Food would be very expensive because Europe would have to be fed. So it started building up a stockpile. And so all of so the Balkan stockpile eventually was used after the war to feed Southern European civilians. And the United Kingdom stockpile, part of it was also sold to Europe and so on. So it starts building up the stockpile, and that's one reason why Bengal can't get any food. I'm sorry. Bengal harvests its own rice crop at the end of December, and the famine comes to an end effectively, although deaths from disease continue for the next year. Famine really is very debilitating. You don't have any ability to resist disease. So there were epidemics of smallpox and cholera and malaria, and especially malaria, I believe. So people continue to die. The famine death toll is controversial again. It's 3 million tons. Now, the figure undercounts starvation deaths. The reason is that there was a lot of starvation death. Even in the 1930s were very bad for Bengal. It was the Depression era. And it hit India very badly. So a lot of people were starving even before the famine happened. And when you calculate the death toll from a famine, what you do is you take the total death toll and you subtract the normal death toll. And when the normal death toll is high, the end result you get is smaller, right? Does it make sense? So because the normal death toll was already very high, you had a lot more deaths from starvation that are counted than in the 3 million. Ultimate cause of the famine, the Bengal famine occurred because the war cabinet had ultimate control over the India's economy. It controlled all the ships, it controlled India's cash. India was not allowed to use its sterling balance to import food. It had enough money to buy food, it had the ships to import food, it was not allowed to use either of them. The United Kingdom instead used all the ships and the available wheat to stockpile for post-war use. And I simply want to point out that currently we have a very similar situation. You have a global shortage of food, and you have a few large companies that control the global food supply, and they can cause famine simply by pursuing their self-interest. In fact, in 2008, there were a number of small famines. A number of analysts have pointed to hedge funds and other big companies that are trading and speculating in commodities. I find it really unconscionable that food and oil and minerals are all bundled together into a commodity that you can invest in. But I think food should be separate because you're starving people. I mean, it's not like if the price of gold increases, I can do without, but you can't do without food. Now, there's a question I haven't addressed, and that's really the question of, was Churchill punishing Indians? And I want to leave that an open question. When you look at the things he was saying, that it's certainly the possibility arises that one of the motivations for denying relief was hostility, maybe outright hatred. That's the end of my talk.
Thank you very much, Madhusree, for very concise representation. We've got some time for questions, so yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really, I learned a lot about the First World War and especially Second World War. I have a question. My next door neighbor in Bangladesh, Dhaka, she came to me just recently, 1 month ago, because she knew I'm a councillor in Tower Hamlet, I have a political background, so she came for me for suggestion or help. As her grandfather was living in Shillong before First World War, and he gave 5,000 rupee for pre-war preparation to the Queen Treasury.
I see.
Okay, and her father, after our Second World War, was trying to get this loan money from Queen Treasury, but still they did not get clue how to get. I have seen these letters. One letter is written from British government that it is accepted. We know this money is taken and it is in Queen Treasury, this 5,000 rupee, but we don't have British bank. There is no clarification that we received it, because that time might have British bank was not existed or something like that. I believe so. And Indian government, you ask your Indian government, so who is responsible to giving this money? We found this money.
World War One.
Yeah, that's it. You see, and still there, still there, because 5,000 rupees before First World War One is too much money. So they are still trying how to get this money. Can you advise?
It's right in the beginning of the book. I deal with that, and that had a lot to do with taxation by the East India Company. Basically, the East India Company was giving out, was auctioning the right to tax. So whoever said, "Oh, I'll give you more money," got the right to tax that particular region, and you had these completely unscrupulous, evil people being let loose in these districts that were owned by the East India Company. They took everything. In fact, there are reports that people were running away to avoid paying tax or selling their children. And then when you had a drought and you had a short crop, what happened was that people did not have any stores left. They had no savings with which to buy grain. Normally they would store enough grain to feed themselves for about 2 years at least, but they had nothing left. So 1770 famine was caused by drought, but its death toll was
personal level, and after all the research of this book,
I read mainly very angry, but I felt that as a writer you can't afford to be angry. It clouds your judgment. So I think I managed to sublimate my anger into real solid research, and that's where I think I succeeded, because a lot of these documents that I looked at, no one had even imagined that they would have anything to do with the famine. So right now, if I read my own book, I get angry. But I have no sense of anger left. I felt that to me, Churchill was kind of like the bull's eye of a larger target. The target I really have is imperialism, and Churchill happens to personify it extremely well. And that's why he's kind of the bullseye, as I said. But hopefully, if you read my book, you'll come across feeling that imperialism itself is an evil institution. I hate the sin, not the sinner, I guess. Or at least I tried.
Did you choose the title of the book?
No, I didn't. That was chosen by the publisher.
Okay, yes.
Hi, thanks for writing the book. I found it very radicalizing. And I have a lot greater hatred for Churchill now. But I also want to know, which is very useful, I also want to know, what were Fazl Haq and these people doing? Were they quite useless? Or
Fazlul Haq had no real power. He was chief minister.
what was he doing? What was he saying?
He was booted out at one point. I think it was March 1943, in fact. Yeah, there was a lot of repression going on in Bengal by the British government, and Fazlul Haq was trying to protest. So at one point, the British governor called him in, handed him a resignation letter, and insisted he sign it. And he actually did. He signed it. And then Bengal politics at that point was very complicated. There was the Muslim League. Fazlul Haq was the head of the Krishan Project. He was the head of a Kishan Projapati, a peasants' party, and he had been able to make a government because he had Hindu friends. Now the Muslim League allied with the European group to make a new government. So you see, Herbert got rid of Fazlul Haq because he was too difficult, and then he got in the Muslim League government to power. and basically the Muslim League government had to do what it was told. So in the Nanavati papers, you see that the chief minister is, I'm sorry, but the name slips me. But the food minister at the Surawarti, right? He wanted to say that there is going to be a famine because we don't have enough food, but he wasn't allowed to say it. So the Muslim League was completely subservient at this point to the British government.
What about figures I associate with a little bit after that time who had a lot of mojo, like Maulana Bhashani?
I'm sorry, I don't know this.
Was he not?
Okay. Question.
Yes. A lot of thought has been given in this country to the teaching of history to children, with the idea that people should have a shared sense of history, that people should be proud of Britain, basically. So if there is a history teacher teaching impressionable young children, what sort of history should they teach when it comes to Churchill? I mean, as his marginality is seen here as a very good guy, you painted him as a very bad guy. Maybe he was both a good guy but also a bad guy.
I think these are questions that are for you to answer, not for me to answer. You know, what sort of history should we teach our children? I think we should teach our children to think, so probably it is a good idea to put forward both sides and let them discuss it.
But I'm completely confused now, because I was aware of what he said about Gandhi, that he didn't want to make India independent, and then your book, which has put Nehru into the picture. But on the other hand, after independence, he became best friends with Nehru, and they used to have sherry together.
I think he had a change of heart. Now, Churchill was a very complicated person, and his personality changed from time to time. When he was in power, he was very arrogant and bumptious and obnoxious. But when he wasn't in power, he was much more approachable. And he said some things that suggest that he regretted his stand on India when he was older. He told his doctor that I wish I had done things differently. And in fact, I tried to look at doctor's actual notes, but these are classified until like the 2020s.
Mm.
So Lord Moran, Churchill's doctor, wrote a memoir kind of in which he wrote a lot of very revealing things about Churchill. And in particular, it says that one of the things he really regretted in the war was blank. There's really a blank in the memoir. I wanted to fill it in, I couldn't. This stuff is classified till 2020. So, you know, I won't be looking at it, maybe some of you can when it stops being classified. So, yes, he was a complicated person. He did have a change of heart. And there was a way in which war and power really went to his head. This kind of transformation, a lot of his friends talked about it. They say, there was one of his friends, Beaverbrook, I think he said, Churchill at the top of a wave is a tyrant. But Churchill at the bottom of a wave, you know, actually he even had Birla over for lunch at his house when he was out of power. So yeah, he was a split personality.
Murad and then Hussein and then...
I just want to add, I think that's why, I think it doesn't help maybe to focus too much on Churchill, but it's more helpful and more educational to look at the institution of imperialism, which he was representing at that point.
Thank you. I always think that the history I was taught was that history is always the victor's version of events. I'm glad to hear this version of events in Bengal. I've suggested my views on Churchill already, but I mean, surely there were different politics in the war cabinet itself. I mean, for example, the British electorate didn't elect Churchill as a war hero and rejected him quite profoundly. Attlee was actually the most able administrator. He showed that subsequent to the 45 election, as well as during the war cabinet. I'm just wondering what the dynamics were there. But the prism seems to be just for Churchill. And the other thing is that surely they were aware of the Indian Army threat, possibly, through Chandra Bose, and whether that played into anything like this. Did it make, for example, Bengalis more amenable to that
so
cause? Yeah, two things which have always...
Okay, the first one about the cabinet. Churchill had a crony cabinet. The key decisions regarding the Bengal famine were taken with the help of Lord Churchill. Grigg was a Secretary for War, and the Leathers was the Minister of War Transport. They took all the decisions. People like Amory had no say. He wasn't a member of the cabinet, but as the Secretary of State for India, he should have had an important role. He didn't. When it came to war-related decisions, Churchill deferred to Alan Brooke, his military advisor. But when it came to civilian decisions, he took them all. He and Churchill in particular. Lord Churchill was responsible for looking after food and shipping, and he was a scientist, so his primary job was looking after technology, but he did a lot more than that. He ran something called the statistics branch. Attlee, my impression is that he was very subservient to Churchill during the war. He doesn't come across as saying anything of relevance with regard to the war. I'm sorry, your second question about Bose. Yes, yeah. Bose was very important. Yeah. There was an assassination order out against Bose. But what's really interesting is that the degree of censorship, you don't see him being discussed at all in the documents. Flat. We do know there was an assassination order. It was discovered by a historian a few years ago.
That was by the British government, was it?
Yeah.
Assassination order.
By Special Operations SOE executive was supposed to assassinate him. And yes, the fact that Bose was Bengali, I think might have had something to do with his particular hostility towards Bengalis, not just Indians. Because at one point he says Bengalis breed like rabbits anyway. So it wasn't just that he hated Indians and Hindus, but there was a certain hostility towards Bengalis in particular.
But Bose was actually, he was actually talking to the Germans and talking to the Japanese and threatening to bring bring an Indian army to fight the British. So it was not really surprising when Churchill's priority was to win the war that, and I think it was very naive actually of Gandhi to try and negotiate, because he wanted immediate independence in exchange for support for the war. But considering the hostility,
I'm not sure. I don't think that was Gandhi's stand. Well, at one point it became.
Well, that's what I thought anyway. That was what.
Hussein, you had your hand up for a long time.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of introduce something wider, and I appreciate your talk, and I think it's really pertinent to try and understand something that is rarely talked about in British schools or institutions, let's say. But you have to remember, I think the war was about Britain surviving as an empire, and India was absolutely critical to that. I mean, it was the jewel in the crown. And Britain was not being very successful in persecuting the war and winning against the Germans. And I think so it was a very survival, and by then, Britain was in effect a declining empire, and you had lots of movements, including India, demanding independence from Britain. So I think, in one sense, the Bengalis paid the price for Britain trying to find any way to kind of maintain its imperial glory and past, let's say. And I think the way I would see it, so in that sense, it wasn't just a strategic choice about the war effort. It was, in essence, about, like you're saying, the very existence of the British Empire and its kind of particular take on imperialism. But I think the second factor related to that is what you've alluded to it, that Winston Churchill, as a representative of British imperialism, was on the most right-wing side of the British imperialists. He was known for that, even within the Conservative Party. He would give every drop of his blood to make sure India would not become independent. I mean, people thought it was crazy within the Conservative Party, and that's at that period saying something, to be honest. They wanted the British Empire, but some people on the more intelligent side of British imperialism understood, look, there's America, there's other powers coming to be, we can't sustain this kind of entity forever. The sun is setting and we have to find an exit strategy. Winston Churchill would not entertain that idea ever. So I think the other thing that maybe is not talked about is his sheer racism. He was completely, not just towards Bengalis and Indians, but breeding like rabbits. That was probably some more diplomatic things that he would say. But to be honest, it was a calculated indifference, let's say. And I think it's related to the independence movement and many, many, many things, you know, in terms of kind of not punishing the Bengalis, but knowing that this would not be detrimental to our interest in India if this played out, let's say. So it wasn't like genocidal in terms of what the Nazis did, but, you know, there's administrative error, things that have gone wrong, let's just not do nothing. And that would kind of strengthen our hand and weaken the opposition. So I think, you know, those complexities come in really, I think. So I think the irony is, probably the Bengal Famine, more than any other event in British imperial history, led to the decline and the finish of the British Empire in India. And I think that's the irony of it. Obviously the Gandhi and the movement for liberation, but also I think people, probably a death.
I'm not sure that Bengal Famine eventually played a big role in the politics. I mean, I think the reason Britain had to leave India was eventually it couldn't control the Indian army. And it would have had to reconquer India with white troops because these rebellions broke out in 1946 in which the naval revolt and so on. So I'm not sure, I mean, Bengal Famine certainly destroyed whatever was left of the legitimacy.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I had a question. I really enjoyed your talk, it was very useful. Sorry, I missed the first half of your talk, but at any point, did you mention the works of Amartya Sen? How does his work relate to, is his hypothesis the same as yours regarding the Bengal Famine?
Well, it's complicated. What Amartya Sen said was he introduced this idea of entitlements, saying that people starve because they lose an entitlement to food, not just because there is a shortage. So I accept that idea because I think it's quite powerful. I mean, in this, what we see is that the poor Bengali villagers had really no entitlement to food. They couldn't purchase it, they weren't given it, they weren't really given adequate relief and so on. But Amartya Sen actually used the Bengal famine to say that this offers proof of my idea, and I don't accept that because I don't think, what he's saying is that the shortage of grain in 1943 was not so high as in itself to cause famine, and I'm not sure that I believe the crop data well enough to actually accept that.
Yeah, Lazarus, you had a point.
So I just wanted to respond to this friend. Because I did a lot of research on the Bengal Famine about 14 years ago for a film for Channel 4 and for the BBC. And I don't think it was indifference. They knew all about what was coming. If you go through the Bengal Gazette, where they actually write down the prices of crop, every week the Bengal Gazette, which is there in the writers' building, which is the headquarters of the Bengal government, you see that they knew from 1942 the prices were completely going out of style. Inflation that Madhusree is mentioning, as well as the procurement that was going on, they had already known. And that punitive action that Albert took against Midnapur. So those were not indifferences.
Yeah,
those were
calculated indifference.
I mean, those
I know
were.
that sounds ironic, but that's.
Yeah, and also the second factor was, it was not only the Japanese, it was Bose there, absolutely on the border of Bengal. And if you talk to some of the Indian civil service officers at that time, like Ananda Shankar Rai, like Ashok Mitra, they were in the service and they had orders, and they thought that if Bose entered with the Japanese army, they would overrun Bengal in 2 weeks. That was their calculation, and that was the order given to the civil service to evacuate and have a government in exile. Bengal government in exile in Ranchi, which was Bihar. And so all orders were, everything was made. So that is why when they say that 9/10 of the boats were destroyed, actually 9/10 of the boats were destroyed. And in East Bengal, when you have, at that time, East Bengal did not have so many roads or bridges. So people were completely stuck. So and then something, the last slide that Madhusree shows that actually the harvest happened in 1943. And if you read the newspaper reports, at that time, actually there were no people. The harvest was there. Absolutely ready harvest was there, but there was no people to harvest them. So it was not as if that there was a massive prophecy. They knew all along. They knew all along what they were doing, and bit of it was absolutely punitive action that was taken. The 1942 Quit India movement, and also the entire Congress leadership was in prison because of the Quit India movement. There was only the Muslim League and the communists. And the communists in Bengal by that time had already bought into the People's War because Russia had declared war against Germany. So the communists knew what was going on, but they could not even go and talk about the British responsibility. It's the only thing that was there. And another thing is actually the person who was in charge of the procurement of rice at that point was Isfahani, who was the Muslim League treasurer. He got the largest, he had the largest contract to procure rice. So all of that, if you put them together, it's very difficult to think that it was sort of calculated indifference rather than it was sort of, it was thought out, well thought out.
Deliver a policy to kill people.
Not deliver a policy to kill people, but they could see, they would have seen that it was, and they could see that it was
Do you
coming.
want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think you know, when the first version I had of my book, I tried to discuss this question of genocide, which is extremely difficult. So I didn't end up going there because you're supposed to decide if there was an intent. And with gas chambers, yes, you can decide. But when it comes to something like this, you know, you can't get in someone's mind.
Okay, there's the man over here and then.
Thank you, Madam, for the presentation. A number of quick queries. Number one is, did the British buy the grains on the market price basis, or did they just steal it?
No, they bought it. But they were printing money, you know. They had huge amounts of cash on hand. And that made the price really go through the roof. The price, you know, went double or 3 times within a matter of days. Yes.
And the second is why?
And actually there was some requisitioning. And I don't really know if they paid fair price. I know with the boats that were destroyed, they paid ridiculously low prices, like 10 rupees a boat or something.
With regard to the production, so far I understand it's not only the Bengal, but the whole of India produced crops and grains. So why, if they had bought grains from the whole of India, why the families in Bengal and only, why not the other parts of India?
Because Bengal was the major producer of rice. So in the army, I think in 1943, ate about more than 100,000 tons of rice because they couldn't get enough wheat and they couldn't get enough. Well, the army was eating 600,000 tons a year. I mean, that's a huge amount to get out of the market. So even though there was a wheat surplus, the prices of wheat were also extremely high. Also, this whole question of inflation, the Punjabi farmer did not want to sell his wheat because he didn't trust the cash. So it's very difficult to know just how much there was in the country and how much there was on the market, the difference. Which is the hoarding.
Was it for particularly for the shipment facility? They focus to Bengal that they can visit the grains and the ship?
Well, I think the famine broke out mainly in Bengal because of scorched earth, because in the entire rice belt you had some form of famine, but it was worse in Bengal because of its proximity to the war, to the Japanese. And also all these factors that I listed, the short crop and so on. And the panic had a huge part to play because everybody who had any stores, they kept it. They didn't release it to the market and they didn't even feed the peasants who normally in those times, if a landowner had land, it was cultivated by poor people who would get food in return. And even that was not available.
There's a question from the man at the back and then the woman at the front. Yeah.
I am one of the person who had the misfortune of living through 1943 famine in Calcutta and 13 years old school boy. Ever since that time, I have been worrying or wondering what the famine did not affect Bihar or Uttar Pradesh or other. Not even Assam, only in Bengal. It was said by Rajesh that the British did not deliberately target the Bengalis in Bengal. But I have seen these thousands of bags of rice rotting away in the Seapool Botanical Garden, and we could not get near the boundary of the garden because of the rotting smell. And again, Isfahani was the bit more at that time, that he was the person who is letting the rice rot, and Churchill was not in the picture at that time. I come to know about Churchill only later. And the other thing that I wondered about the other thing, why did the famine get better in 1944 and 45? War was getting worse at that time.
Because 1944 there was a shortage of wheat actually. There was a huge rice crop at the end of 1943. As Nazir says, it was hard to harvest. But there wasn't a rice shortage, but there was a wheat shortage. But wheat was very important to the army. So at this point, when Wavell, the former army chief, as the Viceroy of India, he worked with the other military commanders to get enough wheat into India in 1944. Because otherwise you would have had the army falling apart and you wouldn't have been able to fight the Japanese. The first question, why didn't Bihar suffer? I don't know, maybe because Bihar is not so dependent on rice. It has a large tribal population and they weren't part of the rice market. They have their own sources of food.
If the British wanted to create a famine in Bihar, they could have easily done it. I'm trying to say that they deliberately targeted Bengal.
I don't think the evidence is there that they deliberately targeted Bengal. I mean, the fact that relief was withheld is very important. But to say that they created the famine, I think they just didn't give a damn.
Okay, give me a minute.
So look at the
Oh, I'm sorry. This one point I wanted to make is that in the War Office documents, you do see that Bengal was seen as a place that would welcome the Japanese if they came. So that was an added reason to have the scorched earth policy in Bengal. Bengalis were seen as being very anti-British. And the fear was that if the Japanese came, they would actually get a lot of help from the Bengali population. So that was one reason why Bengal, they had no problems with implementing a scorched earth policy in Bengal. So in that sense, you can say it was targeted. Sorry?
So I just wanted to know, was the rice, a lot of the rice and wheat in Bengal, was it taken or was it actually sold by the Bangladeshis, like the farmers who stopped farming? Was it actually sold or was it like taken?
There was some requisitioning, but mostly it was sold. In fact, they were happy to sell because they didn't realize that the prices would keep going up. They thought, I'm getting a good price now, I'll sell, but then they couldn't buy anything back.
So it could be partly because of Bangladeshis, maybe they're selfishly selling what they have and maybe not. Did they not keep some for themselves? Or?
I'm sure the landowners kept enough for themselves, yes. Some people kept enough. There were, I think the famine had been, as Nazir said, there were signs that, and in fact that's something I really disagree with Amartya Sen with. He says that the British could not have known that there was going to be a famine because they had the fixation about food shortages, but the evidence is overwhelming that they knew that there was going to be a famine for multiple reasons, and they were not naive the way he's suggesting. They weren't fixated on food shortages. In fact, even if you look at the documents that he himself cites, if you read them carefully, you see a very sophisticated analysis of the famine in terms of inflation and so on. Anyway, I'm sorry. I was trying to answer your question. I'm not sure where I got to.
Madam Blue Shirt.
One comment is in response to brothers and Beth, why these Bengalis targeted at that time. One of the reasons the ex-civil servants, during Pakistani time, I went through some of the archive papers in Bangladesh, where I have found that deliberately the then administration of the British India government treated Bengalis as very bad in a way that they were to them very notorious people to be administered.
I see, okay. Yeah, it's a punishment process.
Yes, it's punishment process. And as you have mentioned that, thousands of people was at that time become victim or died of, famine. The other, one of the points you have not probably studied or mentioned here is during this period, we had at that time in Bengal a very good public health system. Annual, it also included annual inoculation system. As you know that when people are starving, their immunity becomes low day by day. On the other hand, the British government at that time, the people who are controlling the war situation, just stockpile all the inoculations or preventative medicine from villages, from dispensary we call it at that time, from dispensaries to military camp. So this is one of the reasons that for 1 or 2 years people did not have inoculations from the health program, and it would also contributed to this death.
Yeah, I mean
Like
the
food.
army was getting daily doses of quinine, and there wasn't quinine for the civilian population. That's true. And my grandmother died in 1943 of tuberculosis. There was no medicine.
If someone else got a question, I've already asked one.
All right, okay, thank you. Yes. It's very important that we learn about British history. What has been the reaction of the British media to your book?
Surprisingly good. Actually, I received a great review from Max Hastings, who is a very conservative British expert on World War II. And he said the book is very painful to read, but it's basically sound. And so, coming from Max Hastings, that's quite a compliment. I've been, rather pleasantly surprised.
So, what was the reason for you to write this book? Just wanted to understand some of the background behind these sort of objectives that drove you to.
Well, I wrote a book before this one on a hunter-gatherer tribe that lives in the Andaman Islands, and that deals with how their encounters with civilization. And after I wrote that, I realized that I had a lot of basic curiosity about poverty. I had grown up in Calcutta, middle class, having enough, but surrounded by servants who were extremely poor, came from the villages. And if I asked my parents, I got, fairly silly answers about why they were so poor, And I thought, I'm a scientist, and when you are a physicist, what you do is you have a very complex problem. You try to reduce it to a simple problem. So I thought, poverty is really complicated. Maybe if I study famine, which is poverty in one dimension, food, that's it, I'll understand something important about poverty. And so I studied the famine. I thought if I understand what happened here, I'll learn something important about the world as it is. And I think I did. I think these questions have a lot to do with sovereignty, imperialism, and history of imperialism. I think is extremely important to India's poverty. So anyway, that was my motivation.
Thank you. One final question.
So I used to study physics, and then I went into geography. And you were talking about the science advisor to Churchill, who was this asshole physicist who had no heart or anything. Is there anything about the epistemological footprint of physicists at the time? Because in America, there's that guy, Teller, who made the bomb, really mean-minded person.
Well, actually, this guy...
Where are all the nice guys? What happened to...
Who?
Were all these scientists weaponized?
They couldn't stand Churchill. In fact, there was a lecture given by C.P. Snow, who you probably know, who was a physicist and writer of the time, at Harvard, in which he analyzed the influence of Lord Chervil on Churchill and concluded that he wasn't looking at the Bengal Famine. He was looking at the firebombing of German cities, which was also something that Churchill was persuaded to do by Chervil. Of course, this guy Harris is usually blamed for it, but Chervil's advice was key to this decision. So Snow went into this decision, and he concluded that it's extremely dangerous for a head of state to get all his advice from one person, or all his scientific advice from one person. So I felt that the reason why I had never heard about Churchill was that he was rejected by his contemporaries. They couldn't stand him. Snow described him as vicious, and in fact I found in his papers this remarkable paper on eugenics. You have to read it to believe it. He talked about how you could create a society in which the people on top remain permanently on top, and there is no such thing as revolution or even voting. And
tell the slaves they're not slaves.
What?
In your book, it's make sure the slaves know they're not slaves.
Just make sure that you lobotomize them so that they have no ambition and no capacity to suffer, then they will permanently remain a slave class.
How did he get privilege? Was physics like the royal science at the time, or
he became a close friend of Churchill? In 1921, they met at the home of a duke, and they were bosom friends for like 20 years. And during the war, they saw each other every single day, almost. They had dinner together all the time. They went to conferences together. Yeah. It's just amazing that Churchill's best friend was a eugenicist, but actually not that surprising.
I'm going to draw it to a close now. I just want, before I say thank you, I just want to recommend the book again. Maybe I should just pass around my copy so that people can have a look. One of the things that Madhusree has done is she's so skillfully woven together all of the information that has come from these papers, which really demonstrate all of the processes that went towards the way that the famine, the news about the famine was censored, what actually happened, the processes of war, with the personal information which is just touched on here around the eugenics which is being pushed by Cherwell, and the kind of racist attitudes that Churchill had, which was spoken about earlier. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so such a powerful book. So really recommend it. And I'd like to thank you very much for coming here from Germany to give this talk. Thank you.